All right, how the camera works, part 3, the light meter. So what's the light meter? Well, it's an internal measuring device you have in your camera that measures light. And the camera, of course, photography, drawing with light, we need to balance the light to make a correct exposure. We start off with the ISO. We talked about sets the basis of the triangle. The other two are the f-stop, aperture, and the shutter speed. So to get an exposure, we need to balance those out. And our light meter is something that tells us when the two work together. So on your camera, you have a dial that looks something like this one. It's got an M, an S, an A, and a P. Maybe it's got a TV, or it's got an AV. M stands for manual. Manual means you have full control. You choose the shutter speed, you choose the f-stop. Whenever you choose them or move them, you'll see your light meter go one way or another. The S stands for shutter priority. Shutter priority is great when you're shooting something like fast action like sports, and what that is you just choose the shutter speed and then the camera picks the appropriate f-stop to balance that out. A stands for aperture priority, and it's the opposite. So you choose the aperture, which one you want. So maybe you're focused on shallow depth of field, then the camera will pick the correct shutter speed to go with that. And then P stands for stupid. P means that you just a point and shoot. You're not controlling anything. You're just pressing buttons. So we're an M. M for manual. This whole class, we're going to be an M. And in this particular camera, we have a couple turnstiles. We have one right here by our index finger, and that controls our shutter speeds. So as I turn this, the shutter changes. Then there's another one by the thumb in the back, another turnstile. And as I turn that, it adjusts the f-stop. And then at some point, the two are in unison, and the light meter says everything is perfect. And when it is, then you go ahead and you make a photo. There it is. That's a keeper. This is good. All right, so let's crack into that. Light meters. How do they work, and why? Yes, the beloved title slide. The light meter. Alright, so like I mentioned, an exposure is a balance of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And what your light meter is trying to do is measure 18% gray based on all of those combined. 18% gray is what's considered the good overall general exposure. A little bit of shadow, a little bit of highlight, a lot of mid-tone. So what this is illustrating is this camera's specific settings of a 30th of a second at f5.6. The camera says this is a correct exposure to make a photograph of what we see would be a parrot. But what the camera actually sees is just 18% gray. So it doesn't matter where you are or what you're looking at, the camera is just trying to balance your settings to give us 18% gray. And our light meter is going to look something like this. When you look through your viewfinder or on your screen, on the bottom you'll see something roughly that looks like this. This is our shutter speed, this is our f-stop, and this is our light meter. And what these mean, this is a -2, a -1, a 0, a +1, and a +2. These are giving us the differences of stop either under or overexposed. So this little red dial is going to move in either direction as we change these settings. As we move the shutter speed, as we move the f-stop, this is going to go in one of the other directions. What we want is this right in the center. When this is in the center, based on our ISO and these two settings, the camera says that's a good exposure. Or where it's at right now, the light meter is saying that the exposure is almost 2 full stops underexposed. Minus means under, plus means over. Too much light, not enough light. So in this specific instance, we would need to let in more light to balance this out. So we could do that by going to a slower shutter speed to open up to let in more light, and as we did that, we would see this move. Or we can open up on our f-stop. We can go to a more wide open f-stop, and as we did that, we would see this dial move as well. And then once it's in the center, then we would press the button all the way down to get an exposure. Here's a good example of what most of our viewfinders are going to look like in our modern day digital cameras. There's lots of information happening. These are all focal points. And if you remember the end of the lecture on the camera and the lens, we talked about focusing. Each one of these spots is a focal point, and we can choose any one of these or a few of these to be our focal point. And they illuminate red. Down here in the bottom though, outside of our field of view, is all of this information that we have to give us more information about what our settings are at. Focus indicator, this is a really great one to pay attention to set your focus. Now, when you focus on, let's say this is our center point, if we point it to something and it's sharp and then this comes on, then we're in unison. If we focus on something and this does not come on, but it looks sharp to us, then something's off. Our cameras have what's called a diopter, and if you look at the viewfinder off to the right, typically there's a little dial that's got a plus and minus on it. This is to correct for our vision. It's a good thing to set your focus on manual, focus on something until this light comes on. And when that light illuminates, if what you're focusing on is sharp, you're good to go. If it's not sharp, then you need to adjust your diopter until it is sharp. This is a real important thing. So we obviously want our images in focus. Metering mode. We have a number of metering modes as far as how and where we measure our light to get that 18% gray. We'll get into that in a little bit, but this is an indicator of which mode we are in. If we have flash, where's our flash sync on? Our shutter speed, our f-stop, and then here is our exposure. This is our light reader right here. This is the important thing. This is the dial that's going to tell us if we're overexposed or underexposed. We can also see what our ISO is at. We can see, how many frames we've shot or how many we have left. I wouldn't worry too much about that with the size of our memory cards these days. So these are our different metering modes. And we're going to start here on the bottom with this elk sculpture. And this is called multi-segmented or matrix. And this is the traditional metering mode that takes everything into consideration that is in your viewfinder to balance it out to that 18% gray. So whatever you point your lens at, the camera's looking at every bit, every highlight in all of these quadrants and balancing all those together to get 18% gray. And if you have a relatively evenly lit, you have a little bit of highlight, you have a little bit of shadow, it's really not a problem. And this is a perfect exposure for this incident. Now the one right above it, this is called spot metering. And spot metering is really great in difficult lighting situations. And what spot metering is that the light meter only takes in consideration what is inside this little circle, this yellow-orange circle, to measure light. So this is important in this scenario because there's this bright highlight right here on this fern, and then there's all this deep shadow and this dark midtone. If we used matrix metering here, it would try to measure all of this to be 18% gray. And what would end up happening is this highlight would get blown out and these shadows would get really washed out and it wouldn't look really good. So spot metering is very helpful in difficult lighting situations like this. Center weighted is, it's essentially spot metering, but a lot larger. So it's just whatever's in the center. This is also very handy in the same kind of situation. Average metering, it's like if matrix metering got shrunk down a little bit and just puts two center weighted side by side. Generally, we're going to be using these two more often than not. But the goal of each one of these is the same. It's all measuring that 18% gray to get a good exposure based on your settings on your camera. And your internal camera is a reflective light meter. So what that means is it measures light bouncing off of an object and then into the camera, as opposed to an incident light reading, which is light falling on an object or a subject. Now, there's not too much of a discrepancy in most situations, but when you're really fine-tuning some things, like say in a studio or getting a more perfect exposure, you can use a handheld light meter. So you can measure the light falling on the subject, and then you'd set your camera settings to that. Another thing you can do is use a gray card. And a gray card is just that. It's gray, but it's 18% gray. So what you do is you put the gray card into the lighting situation you want to photograph, and you measure the light coming off of the gray card. Now the way you do this is this specific example is the handheld light reading, handheld light meter is reading the light bouncing off the gray card. If you were doing this in camera, you would fill the frame of your viewfinder with the gray card. You wouldn't just do this same photo of this woman holding a gray card, because again the camera is taking everything into consideration, and that's your spot metering. But what you would do, get up close to that, measure the light off the gray card. That's 18% gray. That's going to give you the midtones, the highlights and shadows to give you a more precise light reading. Now, so let's say you have some situations where you don't have a gray card with you, or maybe you can't get up close to a subject. There's a few things you can do. So in this top example, the background's really bright and the subject is in shade. So if we just followed the metering of just the two of them together, it's a great exposure on the background, but the subject gets a little dark. So one thing to do is to just get up close to that subject. Get up close, fill most of the frame with that skin tone, read the light bouncing off of them, keep the settings at those settings, and then you back up and you recompose. Now your camera, in that last frame on the right in the top, the meter will be telling you that the exposure is wrong. And it's because it's trying to do that first frame. But you want a better exposure on the person, the subject, so you're actually going to ignore the light meter in this situation because you already set your settings. And this is the whole point of using manual, of understanding how light bounces off the subject. Just like in the second example of this painter, same exact kind of scenario happened, but the reciprocal, where the subject is too bright because of the metering trying to balance the shadows in the background, the light on the woman painter, and so she got blown out. So it's the same exact scenario. You just get up close, fill the frame with her skin tone, read the exposure for that, leave your settings at those settings, back up and recompose, and you can see in that last example on the right in the center, it's a much better exposure. There's better tonality in her skin, better tonality in her outfit, and she's definitely separated from the background. In this last one, if you're photographing like this city with midday, and obviously you can't get close in this scenario, but that sky is really overwhelming the whole scene. All you have to do is just tilt your camera down, get a light reading on the subjects that are outside of that sky, and then same, just recompose, follow your meter, and then take your photograph. Another good example here of underexposed here. So when you underexpose a photo, you don't have enough light, so it's going to look darker. And here the subject is this dinosaur sculpture. And that same scenario here, this meter reading of 2/50th of a second at f11 is for the entire scene. But if we wanted to see this actual sculpture, we need to expose brighter. So again, moving up closer. And this is handy if you have something like a telephoto lens or a ladder, I suppose, to definitely get in a lot closer to what you want to be the subject. You can see this, the reading is drastically different. From 2/50th now of a second went down to 1/60th of a second. So that's 2 stops more light. And then zoomed out, recomposed, much better, much more information. We can actually see, scales, definition of this sculpture a lot better than we could not before because it was too dark. And then this one, really understanding what you want the image to be. This is a great example because there's, not a whole lot happening as far as it's really minimal. There's just this dark box. We see this beautiful thing of light on this, this subject, and it was metered for the light. So the photographer metered for the light here on the subject and not the whole scene. That way, letting this go nice and shadowy, letting this pop out as far as these highlights really pop off at you, a little better balanced light, much nicer. So this is a good example of then understanding the light and how you can use your light meter to make the scene happen the way you want it to be. Not just following, but really making things happen. And then down here we actually see the histogram for this. And what's the histogram? The histogram is next, part 4, and the last one, I know, right, of how the camera works. But the light meter, very important. Every single image you take from here on out, it's going to be a manual. You're going to be following the settings and capturing the image the way you want it to be captured, not just the way the camera, you know. So up next, the histogram. I need ice.